You would not make it through a single day, not because you are weak, not because you lack intelligence or will, but because the world that existed 2,000 years ago, during the time of Jesus, operated by a set of physical, biological, and social rules so foreign to everything the modern body expects, that most people reading this sentence could not survive its most ordinary Tuesday. This is what that world actually looked like. Stand at the edge of a village in the hills of Galilee. The year is somewhere around 6 CE. The sun is not yet up. The air is cold in a way that surprises you, because Galilee, in the popular imagination, is warm and pastoral, golden with afternoon light. But the hills here drop to near freezing on winter mornings, and the stone walls of the houses around you, which have been absorbing cold all night, radiate it outward like a natural refrigerator. You slept on a mat on a packed earth floor. There was no mattress, no pillow in any sense you would recognize, and no separation between where you slept and where the family's animals came in from the cold. The smell inside a first-century Galilean home is one of the first things that would stop a modern visitor cold. This is not a documentary about how people were different 2,000 years ago. This is a reconstruction of what it physically cost to be alive. The province of Galilee, in the 1st century CE, sits inside one of history's most contested landscapes. Rome controls the entire eastern Mediterranean basin by this point, and its authority is not abstract. It is administrative, military, and economic in ways that reach into every household in the region. The local ruler, Herod Antipas, is a client king, meaning he governs at Rome's pleasure and collects taxes on Rome's behalf. He is building 2 major cities during this period, Sepphoris and Tiberias, projects that require enormous amounts of labor, stone, and money that he extracts from the agricultural villages surrounding him. Galilee itself is roughly 70 kilometers from north to south, a small province by any measure, but topographically complex. The hills that define the landscape rise to over 1,200 meters in the upper regions and drop sharply to the Sea of Galilee, which sits 200 meters below sea level. The variation in elevation means the climate shifts dramatically over short distances. The lower villages around the lake are warm and humid. The hilltop villages where most people actually live are colder, drier, and windier. The Via Maris, the ancient military and trade road connecting Syria to Egypt, runs directly through the Galilean lowlands. This road is not a background feature, it is a daily reality. Roman military units move along it. Tax convoys travel it. Soldiers requisition food and lodging along its length. A village within sight of the Via Maris is a village that sees Rome's face every time someone steps outside the gate. Now walk into the village itself. Excavations at Capernaum, the fishing town on the northern shore of the Sea of Galilee that appears throughout the Gospels, have revealed what a first-century Jewish village actually looked like at ground level. The homes are built from locally quarried black basalt stone, fitted together without mortar in many cases, with walls roughly 60 to 90 centimeters thick. The interiors are small. A single room in a Capernaum home averages between 15 and 25 square meters, roughly the size of a large walk-in closet by modern American standards. Multiple rooms cluster together around shared courtyards, and these clusters are extended family units. Grandparents, parents, and married children with their own families might share walls and a courtyard between them. Privacy in the modern sense does not exist. There is no separate bedroom. There is no separate kitchen. The fire for cooking is built in the same space where the family sleeps. The animals, a donkey for carrying loads, goats for milk, chickens, are brought inside the outer gate of the courtyard at night, and sometimes sheltered in the lower portion of the home itself during cold seasons. The floor is packed earth or, in more prosperous homes, basalt flagstone. There is no furniture in any recognizable sense. People sit on mats or low wooden stools. They eat from common dishes placed on a mat on the floor. They sleep on rolled-up bedding that is stored against the wall during the day. The roof, flat and made of wooden beams covered with packed mud and straw, is used for sleeping in summer, for drying food, and for gathering in the evenings when the air cools. A study of the roof materials used in Capernaum homes shows the mud layer is typically only about 15 centimeters thick, meaning it requires constant repair after winter rains. There is no glass in the windows. Windows are small openings in the stone walls, sometimes fitted with wooden shutters, sometimes covered only with cloth. Insects move freely. Flies, the primary vector for trachoma and intestinal disease in the ancient world, are constant residents. Dust from the road settles on every surface. In summer, the Galilean wind picks up fine particles from the valleys and deposits them across everything. Here is the detail almost nobody mentions when they picture biblical life. The smell of this world would be the first thing to overwhelm a modern visitor. Human and animal waste, smoke from cooking fires burning inside enclosed stone rooms, unwashed bodies and clothing, fermented fish sauce used as a condiment, the iron smell of blood from household animal slaughter, the rot of food scraps in a world without refrigeration, all layered together in a space where a modern person's entire nervous system would be screaming for exit. But the village residents do not experience this as overwhelming. They were born into it. Their olfactory systems are calibrated for it, and this points to the first fundamental difference between that body and yours. The first-century body has been shaped by its environment from birth. It carries immunities you do not carry. It has been conditioned to physical demands that would injure you within days. You arrive in this world as a biological outsider, and the environment will begin identifying you as such almost immediately. Let us begin the day properly. Before sunrise, the household wakes. There is no alarm, no coffee, no gradual transition. Sleep ends because the night is over and the work cannot wait. The fire must be restarted because it went out overnight. Starting a fire without matches or a lighter using flint and tinder is a skill, and it takes time, several minutes minimum even, for experienced hands, longer in damp or windy conditions. Once the fire is burning, the cooking begins, but before anything can cook, the grain must be ground. Bread is the foundation of every meal. Barley bread is the standard for poor households. Wheat is more expensive and reserved for special occasions or wealthier tables. But whether it is barley or wheat, it must be ground by hand. The grinding stone, two circular basalt or limestone millstones fitted together, is turned by hand until the grain beneath is reduced to flour. This is not a quick process. Ethnographic studies of hand grinding suggest that producing enough flour for a family's daily bread takes 1 to 2 hours of continuous effort. It is physically demanding work, and it is performed every single morning. While the grinding is underway, water must be fetched. In most Galilean villages, water comes from a communal cistern or a nearby spring. In Capernaum, the lake is close, but in inland hill villages, the water source might be a 10 to 15-minute walk from the home. A household with several members and animals might need 30 to 40 liters of water for daily cooking, drinking, and basic cleaning. This water is carried in clay jars weighing several kilograms when full, balanced on the head, or carried by hand. The morning water run happens before breakfast and before the working day begins. Now consider the arithmetic. You have woken on a cold stone floor. You have restarted a fire by hand. You have ground grain for an hour while breathing smoke in an enclosed room. You have walked to a water source and carried 40 liters home, and the sun is not yet fully up. Your lower back is already registering the night's sleeping surface. Your eyes are watering from smoke. Your hands are raw from the grinding stone, and you have not yet begun the actual work of the day. This is the part that stops modern people cold. We talk about the ancient world as if its difficulty was external: war, famine, disease, as events that occasionally interrupted an otherwise bearable existence. But the difficulty of first-century Galilean life was not episodic. It was structural. It was built into every hour of every day. The morning routine alone required physical outputs that most modern people could not sustain for a week. The food you will eat today, assuming everything goes well, is barley bread. The loaves are small, round, and flat, baked on a stone over the fire. With the bread, you might have a handful of olives preserved in brine from last season's harvest, a small portion of lentils boiled with onion, and if you are near the lake, a piece of dried, salted fish. Fresh fish would only appear in communities near the fishing industry. Oil pressed from local olives is the primary fat in the diet, used both for cooking and as a condiment on bread. There is no sugar, there is no coffee or tea. The common beverage is water, and in households that can afford it, diluted wine. Wine in the ancient world is not primarily a luxury, it is a safer liquid than untreated water in many environments, because the alcohol suppresses certain bacterial populations. A daily consumption of diluted wine is more medical than indulgent for much of the population. The caloric content of this diet is real but not generous. An adult male performing agricultural labor in the heat of a Galilean summer requires roughly 2,500 to 3,000 calories per day. A diet of barley bread, olives, and legumes can technically meet this, but it leaves no margin. A bad season, a poor olive harvest, an animal that sickens and must be killed, and the margin vanishes. Chronic low-level undernutrition is a background condition of peasant economies throughout recorded history, and first-century Galilee is no exception. But here is the detail that flips the whole scene. Even when the food is available, the experience of eating it is not what you imagine. The bread contains grit. Ground on stone millstones, the flour inevitably includes microscopic particles of the stone itself, and these particles are hard enough to wear away tooth enamel over years. Examination of dental remains from ancient populations that relied on stone-ground grain shows significant rates of tooth wear, root exposure, abscesses, and tooth loss by early adulthood. The daily bread is slowly destroying the teeth of the people who eat it. They feel this as chronic dental pain, a background condition that has no treatment beyond extraction, which itself carries the risk of infection. Now you need to work. The agricultural economy of Galilee is organized around the seasonal cycle, and the demands of that cycle are absolute. From October through December, the early rains come, and the soil must be plowed and seeded. From January through March, the growing season requires weeding and maintenance. April through June brings the grain harvest, the most intense labor period of the year, when every available adult is working in the fields from first light to last. July and August are the driest and hottest months. September and October bring the olive and grape harvests, which require their own intensive labor cycles. Plowing is done with a wooden plow tipped with iron or bronze, pulled by an ox or donkey across rocky hillside terraces. The terraces themselves are ancient technology, built by generations of farmers who carried stones by hand up the hillsides to create level growing surfaces. Maintaining those terraces is an ongoing obligation. A terrace wall that collapses after winter rains loses its soil to erosion down the slope. Rebuilding it is days of manual labor. Harvesting grain is done with a hand sickle, bending at the waist and cutting stalks one armful at a time. Modern mechanized harvesting is almost impossible to compare directly, but studies of pre-industrial grain harvesting show that an adult worker can harvest roughly a quarter to a third of an acre per day under favorable conditions. A family's subsistence plot, typically between 1 and 3 acres in Galilee, takes 5 to 10 workdays to harvest. Every member of the household who can work participates. Threshing is done by spreading the cut grain on a threshing floor, a flat stone surface, and driving animals over it repeatedly until the grain separates from the chaff. The grain is then winnowed by throwing it into the air with wooden forks and letting the wind carry away the lighter chaff. This process takes additional days for even a modest harvest. Then there are the day laborers. Not everyone in first-century Galilee owned or rented a plot of land. A significant portion of the rural poor were landless workers who gathered each morning at the village gate or the town square, waiting to be hired by landowners who needed extra hands. The parable of the workers in the vineyard in Matthew 20 describes exactly this scene. Men standing at the marketplace from early morning, some hired at dawn, some at mid-morning, some at the third hour, some not until the final hour before sunset. The denarius they receive, roughly equivalent to a modern day's minimum wage in purchasing power, is described as a fair wage. This is the economic flaw. Miss the morning hire, and you eat nothing that day. There is no unemployment benefit. There is no food bank. There is nothing. Now watch what happens to your body in this world. The average life expectancy at birth in first-century Judea and Galilee, when infant and child mortality is factored in, is estimated by demographers at between 25 and 35 years. This figure sounds shocking until you understand what is driving it. Infant mortality in pre-modern agrarian societies typically runs between 30 and 40%. Children who survive their first 5 years face further mortality risks from childhood illness, accident, and nutrition-related vulnerability. But those who survive into adulthood and avoid violent death can live into their 50s, 60s, and beyond. However, surviving into adulthood in this world does not mean surviving intact. The body of a 35-year-old Galilean peasant farmer carries a lifetime of accumulated damage that would be unrecognizable on a modern medical scan: dental wear and abscesses from stone grit bread, spinal compression from years of carrying loads, respiratory damage from cooking fire smoke inhaled daily in enclosed rooms, intestinal parasite loads that have been present since childhood, eye disease from fly contact and dust, skin conditions from sun exposure without protective clothing. Archaeology gives us a direct window into this. Coprolite analysis, the examination of fossilized human waste from Roman-era latrines in Jerusalem and nearby sites, has identified the eggs of multiple intestinal parasite species, including whipworm, roundworm, and tapeworm, as near universal in the population. These are not exceptional findings. They represent the normal biological condition of people living without sealed water systems, waste separation, or consistent hygiene infrastructure. The effects of chronic intestinal parasite infection include nutrient competition, meaning the parasites are consuming a portion of the food the host eats, fatigue, abdominal pain, and immune suppression. You arrive in this world from a modern country with municipal water treatment, sewage infrastructure, refrigerated food storage, and a medicine cabinet. Within days of drinking from an open cistern or consuming food prepared without modern hygiene standards, your digestive system would begin failing in ways the population around you has learned to endure, but your body has no defense against. There are no antibiotics. There are no antiparasitic medications. There are no painkillers beyond preparations of willow bark for fever reduction and various herbal remedies whose effectiveness varies widely. If you develop an infected wound, the treatment is poultice-based. If the infection progresses to sepsis, you die. Full stop. This is where the story stops being romantic. The Gospels are saturated with healing narratives. Lepers, paralytics, people with chronic bleeding conditions, people who are deaf, blind, mute, possessed by what the text calls unclean spirits. All of these figures crowd the pages of the Synoptic Gospels. Modern readers often read these accounts as demonstrations of divine power, requiring a miraculous framework. But the historical reading is equally important. The Gospels are populated with sick people because first-century Galilee was populated with sick people. The healings are not background color. They are the most urgent news in the world they describe. Now let us talk about what was being taken from you. The taxation system operating in first-century Galilee is not a single system. It is a stack of systems, each layer extracting from a population that cannot afford any of them individually. The Roman tribute is the base layer. Rome requires tribute from conquered provinces, and this tribute is collected in coin. This creates an immediate structural problem for agricultural households whose income is primarily in kind, grain, olive oil, wine, fish. To pay taxes in coin, farmers must take their produce to market and sell it, typically at rates set by merchants who understand the farmer's urgency. The exchange is systematically unfavorable to the farmer. Above the Roman tribute sits the Herodian taxation administered by Herod Antipas's regional government. Herod is building. Sepphoris, just 6 kilometers from Nazareth, is being rebuilt during Jesus' childhood and early life into a Roman-style administrative city. Tiberias is being constructed on the western shore of the Sea of Galilee. These projects require money. They require it from the villages. Above the Herodian layer sits the religious obligation layer. The Torah requires a tithe, 10% of agricultural income, to support the Levites and the temple system. There is a second tithe, used to fund festival pilgrimage to Jerusalem. And there is the temple tax, a half-shekel annual payment required of every adult Jewish male. Pilgrimage itself costs money, in travel, and in the mandatory purchase of temple-approved sacrificial animals at markups imposed by the money changers and animal vendors operating in the temple precincts. Scholars who have studied the combined extraction burden on first-century Galilean peasant households estimate it at somewhere between 25% and 40% of annual household output, depending on circumstances. For a household already farming subsistence land, this is not a tax. It is the systematic elimination of any buffer between the family and destitution. The mechanism of descent is well documented in comparative peasant economics. A household with no buffer hits a bad season. Perhaps the rains failed, and the barley yield is half of normal. The family cannot meet its tax obligations. They borrow. Loans in the ancient world are not made at modest interest rates. Interest rates of 20 to 50% annually are documented in texts from the Roman period. The debt grows. By the following year, if the harvest does not dramatically improve, the collateral for the loan, which is typically the land itself or the labor of household members, is called in. The family loses the land. They become tenants on land they formerly owned, now paying a rental portion of each harvest on top of their tax obligations. Land concentration in Roman Galilee is not a modern scholarly inference. The parable of the tenants in Mark 12 describes a landlord who plants a vineyard, equips it, and then leaves it in the hands of tenant farmers while he goes away. This is not a metaphorical economic arrangement. It is a description of the primary agricultural structure in which most Galilean farming households operated. The absentee landlord was not a villain of parable. He was the expected face of ownership. And then there is debt slavery. Jewish law, drawing on Leviticus and Exodus, permits a creditor to claim a debtor's person or household members as bonded laborers when a debt cannot be repaid. The period of bondage is limited to 6 years under Torah law, after which the bonded person goes free, but 6 years of a household member's labor extracted to repay a debt is not a theoretical risk for families operating at the edge of survival. It is a near-constant threat. The Jubilee, prescribed in Leviticus 25 as a 50th year cancellation of all debts and return of all land to original families, exists in the Torah precisely because the problem it addresses is real and recurring. Whether or not the Jubilee was ever practically implemented in the first century is debated. What is not debated is why the legislation exists. Debt was destroying families. Land was concentrating. Bondage was spreading. The Jubilee is a legal emergency response to a social catastrophe. Most reconstructions leave out what this smelled like to the people living inside it. Not the physical smell, though that is real enough. The psychological smell of a system that leaves no exit. You are a day laborer in Galilee around 20 CE. You own nothing. You rent a room in a shared courtyard from a household that is itself one bad season from losing its home. You work when you are hired and eat what you earn. When you are not hired, you eat nothing. You have no credit, no savings, no property, and no legal standing to challenge any of the extraction systems pressing down on you. You are also, according to the purity system of your religious community, potentially carrying a condition, a skin rash, a bleeding problem, proximity to a corpse at a burial, that makes you legally unclean, which means you cannot enter the synagogue, cannot participate in communal meals, cannot be present at religious festivals, and cannot be touched by members of the community without contaminating them. Let us talk about the purity system carefully, because it is usually misunderstood. The Jewish purity system of the 1st century is not primarily about hygiene in the modern sense, though hygiene is implicated in some of its rules. It is a comprehensive framework for managing the boundary between the sacred and the ordinary, the living and the dead, the intact and the degraded. Contact with a corpse renders a person unclean for 7 days. Childbirth renders a woman unclean for a period following the birth. Certain skin conditions, certain bodily discharges, certain animal carcasses, all generate states of impurity that require ritual cleansing, waiting periods, and in some cases, priestly certification before the person can re-enter communal and sacred spaces. The mikveh, the ritual immersion pool, is how most impurity states are resolved. You immerse fully in water and the impurity is lifted. Mikvaot have been found throughout 1st century Jewish sites in Galilee and Judea, including in ordinary village homes, suggesting that ritual immersion was a regular practice, not an occasional religious event. The system was being actively maintained by ordinary people as a feature of daily life. But here is what the system cost people on its margins. If you have a chronic skin condition that does not heal, you are chronically impure. You cannot be certified clean by the priest because the condition recurs. You live in a state of permanent social exile from the community structures that organize everything: religious practice, economic networks, family life. The Gospel's lepers are not simply people with a disease. They are people who have been legally removed from their community by a system that has no provision for their return except miraculous cure. When a hemorrhaging woman reaches through the crowd to touch the fringe of Jesus' cloak in Mark 5, she has been in a state of ritual impurity for 12 years. 12 years of being untouchable, 12 years of her touch contaminating anyone she contacted, 12 years of economic and social marginalization layered on top of the physical suffering of her condition. The text says she had spent everything she had on physicians and had only gotten worse. This is not incidental detail. It is a precise description of a specific person destroyed by the intersection of illness, poverty, and purity law simultaneously. Now step onto the road. The Via Maris runs through the Lower Galilee, and if your village is anywhere near it, Roman military activity is not distant news. It is a recurring physical encounter. Roman soldiers are present at road checkpoints, in market towns, at tax collection periods, and wherever Herod Antipas's administrators require enforcement. The Roman military unit you are most likely to encounter in Galilee is not a full legion. Rome's major units are stationed in Syria. What you see are auxiliary cohorts, locally recruited soldiers under Roman command, and their behavior toward the civilian population is not consistently disciplined. The institution of angaria, military requisition of civilian labor and goods, is codified in Roman law. A soldier can compel a civilian to carry military equipment for 1 Roman mile. 1 Roman mile is approximately 1,400 meters. This is not a fine or a tax. This is compelled physical labor that can happen at any moment to any civilian with no advance warning and no compensation. The Sermon on the Mount text in Matthew 5 that says, "If anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with them 2, is not a metaphor about going beyond expectations. It is a specific legal reference to a humiliation the people listening to it had personally experienced. Crucifixion, Rome's standard method of public execution for non-citizens convicted of sedition, theft, or revolt, was not hidden. It was designed to be visible. Crosses were erected at roadsides, at city gates, at elevated points where they could be seen from a distance. The body was left on the cross after death, sometimes for days, as an ongoing deterrent message. First-century Jewish sources, including Josephus, describe crucifixion as the most feared of all Roman punishments, and its use was not reserved for exceptional cases. During the suppression of the revolt of Judas of Galilee around 6 CE, Roman forces crucified an estimated 2,000 men. The crosses were visible from the road. The children growing up in Galilee, in the years that followed, did not learn about crucifixion from books. They saw it. This is the political ground that the Sermon on the Mount is delivered onto. Not abstract spiritual soil, specific political soil, Roman soldiers on the road, tax collectors at the gate, debt records held by wealthy creditors in Tiberias, sick bodies with no treatment, impure people excluded from their communities, and into this world, into this specific, grinding, documented, archaeological weight of a world, a carpenter from Nazareth climbs a hillside and says, "Blessed are the poor, blessed are those who mourn, blessed are the meek." Now the sun is going down. In the modern world, sunset is an aesthetic event. In the first-century village, it is an infrastructure event. As the light fades, the world goes dark in a way that modern people have no reference point for. There are no streetlights, no electric lights inside homes, no exterior lighting of any kind. The only light available after dark is fire, cooking fires, torches, and oil lamps. The standard domestic oil lamp of the first century is a small clay vessel, roughly 8 to 12 centimeters across, with a pinched spout where the wick sits. The wick is typically twisted flax. The fuel is olive oil. The light produced is approximately equivalent to a single modern candle. A house with one lamp burning in the central room is the typical situation for an ordinary household. Olive oil is not free. A household budget that is under consistent extraction pressure cannot burn lamps all night. The oil is rationed. When it runs out, the lamp goes dark. The parable of the 10 virgins in Matthew 25, 5 of whom have enough oil for their lamps, and 5 of whom do not, is not a trivial domestic detail used to make a spiritual point. For its audience, the scenario is immediately intelligible as a crisis. You are out of oil, the lamp is dark, and whatever you needed to do by lamplight cannot be done. Movement outside the village after dark is genuinely dangerous. The roads are unpaved stone tracks. Cisterns, many of them open or covered only with a stone slab, are positioned near roads and paths. The risk of falling into a cistern in total darkness is not trivial. Animals that are dangerous to humans, hyenas, wolves, and wild dogs, are more active at night in the rural landscape of first-century Judea. Robbery on roads, which is documented extensively in ancient sources, including the parable of the Good Samaritan, is far more likely after dark when no witnesses are present. The village shuts down at nightfall. People are inside. The gates of the town are closed, the animals are secured, and 12 hours of darkness begin, 12 hours in which the only activity is sleeping, nursing infants, and occasionally feeding the fire to maintain warmth. 12 hours of darkness, every night, for an entire lifetime. The psychological dimension of this is almost impossible to reconstruct for a modern person who has never experienced a power outage lasting more than a few hours. The Gospel of John opens with one of the most famous sentences in ancient literature. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. But the sentence most of the audience would have felt most immediately in their bodies appears a few verses later. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. Light overcoming darkness is not a metaphor for a population that spends half of every day in near total blackness. It is a description of their most urgent daily reality, translated into theological language. We have now followed you through a single day in first-century Galilee, from before dawn to after dark, and we have not placed you in any exceptional circumstances. No military raid, no epidemic, no famine, no earthquake, no flood. Just an ordinary day with its ordinary demands. Here is what that ordinary day required of your body. You slept on a stone floor and woke in the cold. You started a fire by hand. You ground grain for an hour while breathing smoke. You carried 40 liters of water from a communal source. You ate bread with grit in it and olives, and possibly some dried fish. You worked in a field from sunrise to midday under the sun, or you stood at a gate hoping to be hired and were not, and you ate nothing. You carried loads that your back is not conditioned for. You drank water from a cistern that contains organisms your immune system has no training to fight. You breathed smoke for most of the day in the cooking and heating of your home. Your teeth hurt. Your eyes are irritated from dust and flies. You have no idea whether what you planted will be sufficient after the tax collector takes his portion. And in 12 hours, the world went dark, and it stayed dark, and there was nothing you could do about it until the sun came back. And here is what makes this more than a history lesson. When you read the words attributed to Jesus in Matthew 11, "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest." The word translated weary in the Greek is kopionto, from kopos, which means to toil to the point of exhaustion. The word translated burdened is pep hortis menoi, which means to have been loaded down with a heavy weight, as an animal is loaded. The people Jesus is addressing with this specific sentence are not metaphorically tired. They are exhausted in the muscles, in the back, in the digestive system, in the debt register, in the social record of their impurity status. They are carrying loads that are physically real, and the rest being offered is not merely spiritual repose. In a world without weekends, without labor law, without any legal limit on what an employer or a tax collector or a creditor can demand of your body, rest is a political statement. Now consider what this changes. Reading the New Testament without the historical weight of first-century Galilean life is like reading a letter without knowing anything about the person who wrote it or the crisis they were writing through. The letters make grammatical sense, you can extract meanings from them, but you are missing the specific gravity that makes each sentence exactly as heavy as it is supposed to be. The Lord's Prayer in Matthew 6 is 6 sentences. 3 of them are specifically about the material conditions of first-century Galilean life. Give us this day our daily bread. This is a request made by people for whom tomorrow's food is genuinely uncertain. Forgive us our debts, as we also have forgiven our debtors. The word translated debts in the original Greek is ophelema, which means a literal financial debt, not a poetic metaphor for sin. The petition for debt forgiveness is made by people living inside an economy that is systematically generating debt they cannot repay. Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. The Greek word translated evil here, poneros, can also mean the evil one, but in its most direct usage, it describes something burdensome, oppressive, hard to bear, labor-intensive, in the way that grinding grain every morning is labor-intensive. Deliver us from the thing that grinds us down. The most important historical fact about Jesus of Nazareth is not theological, it is geographical and social. He is from a village, Nazareth, with an estimated population of 200 to 400 people, in the hills of Galilee, 6 kilometers from Sepphoris, which is being built by Herod Antipas, using tax money extracted from the surrounding villages during Jesus' childhood. He grows up in a household that is likely involved in construction or woodworking, occupations that in this era are not the prosperous trades of modern imagination, but skilled labor performed by people who are one level above the landless poor. He teaches in the fishing villages on the shores of the Sea of Galilee, in the marketplace towns of the region, and eventually on the road to Jerusalem. His audience is not a philosophical seminar. It is not a comfortable middle class. It is the people we have spent this video reconstructing. Day laborers, tenant farmers, fishermen paying both Roman tribute and the taxes of the fish market licensing system, women carrying water jars, sick people, indebted people, people whose bodies are carrying a week of chronic pain as a normal operating condition. When that audience hears a teaching, they hear it with bodies that are tired, eyes that are sore, stomachs that are uncertain whether there will be enough food tomorrow, and ears that have spent their whole lives listening to systems telling them that their value is equivalent to their productive labor output for someone wealthier than themselves. That context does not replace the theological reading, it deepens it to the point where the two become inseparable. One thing is worth sitting with as you finish watching this. The next time you read a verse from the Gospels that you think you already understand, try reading it with a back that has been grinding grain since before dawn, with eyes irritated from a smoky fire, with the quiet knowledge that the tax collector is due in 3 weeks, and this year's olive harvest was poor. The words do not change, but the weight of them does. What would it have meant to you, in that body, in that world, to hear someone say, "You are blessed"?